No, that's the old, oh, somebody just different. Yeah, do you want me pressing on your end there, the recording?
The recording's on. But just my apologies, I just have to take this call. Give me 1 second.
Okay, because I. Yeah, you do that.
Whoops, got it. Oh, Brenda came in. Shall I admit her? Brenda came in. Shall I admit her?
There's nobody watching your credit.
Let's see.
There is somebody.
There she is. Hi, Brenda.
Hello.
Oh, hi, good morning. How are you? Good to see you.
Michael will be here in a minute. Oh.
Yeah. What was the teacher's?
My apologies. Oh, there's Brenda. Okay.
Morning, Michael.
So welcome Brenda and Anna and everyone who's here. I'll just remind you all that this is being recorded. And right now, Brenda and Anna, have you on mute. I'll let you know when it'll be appropriate for you to participate. So don't worry, I'll give you a chance to express yourselves at some point during the lesson. Okay. Absolutely, absolutely. There's also, the etiquette and the practice of using Zoom and virtual is fascinating. They have all these, mute and unmute and all sorts of interesting terms. We use, today the word to claim or reclaim has all sorts of different connotations to it, especially with regards to Indigenous matters. But here you have, if you've given the hosting to somebody else, or it says reclaim host. So you can reclaim the authority that you transferred to somebody else. So these new terms, it's fascinating. Anyway, okay. Marion. Yeah. So I'm going to start with a question. I'm going to ask you this. If you were to divide percentage-wise, let's say something has 60% versus 40%, the importance of the spoken word versus the written word in Jewish tradition, where would you put those two comparatively in terms of their importance? The spoken word versus the written in our tradition. Take a moment and think about it before you answer. Don't answer hastily. Percentage, let's say I might say 50% spoken, 50% written. You can either do it according to your understanding of tradition, or for you personally, just distinguish when I ask you for your answer. For you personally, the written word is more important, or this percentage versus the spoken word, or from your understanding of our traditional approach to the spoken and written word in Jewish tradition. So take a moment, don't rush. Yeah. Yeah. I'm talking about where you feel about that, or how you understand our tradition relates to those two. Okay, take a moment. Don't answer immediately. And what I suggest is Anna, Marion, and Brenda, maybe just put something in the chat box if you have an answer, and I'll share that with everybody else. So take a moment and think about that. Don't be uncomfortable with the unspoken silence. Okay, so this isn't a meditation exercise where you have half an hour to think about that. We do want to move on. So I'll just share with you. Anna said 70% spoken, 30% written. Is that your personal, Anna, or that's your personal feeling about it? Great. Anyone else have anything they want to share? Rosalie?
More percentage for the spoken because personally, that's what I'm most comfortable with and have more history with, experience with. I can't read written Yiddish, I can read written Hebrew, I can't read written Yiddish. So I would say more of a percentage of the spoken.
Okay, so I don't know if, are you at home able to hear what Rosalie said? Did you hear? No. All right. So Rosalie said that she places more, if not an exact percentage, on the spoken as opposed to written. Okay, Bela.
In the Orthodox word, as is geschrieben, is gesucht, and that it's the following in the traditional world is that if it's written down, you follow it. From my generation, the spoken word is much more meaningful. If you were to ask the current generation, they would say written because their whole communication is written. So I would say they would go 70-30 written to the spoken. For me, it would be 70-30 spoken to written.
Okay, so Bela says 70-30 spoken to written, but the current generation probably the reverse of that. So I would ask you, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. When you're talking about the current generation, is that their response to Jewish tradition or in general? Sounds like more a general comment of how they relate.
They wouldn't necessarily pick up in the same way.
Okay. So they may not even pick up a written source because look on Google. Okay, Barbara. Oh, sorry.
I would say written word 75%, spoken word 25%, because we are the people of the book and we do so much reading. We read online, and we read online. But I think that spoken is important, but doesn't take up nearly as much space or time as the written word.
Okay.
I would suggest that, given the current state of communication in our world, a lot of people, maybe not my generation, it's into the written and not necessarily the interaction between people. Everything is, I'll send you a text, I'll send you a note, text me, read this. I want to see somebody's face. I want to talk to them. No, they're too busy.
So you're convinced that the
Lack of, I'm going to say a lack of direct communication. And if we look at what's happened, I'm going to put it into more modern times, like this pandemic. They're doing everything. My doctor doesn't talk to me face to face. He phones me. He wants to talk to me on the phone. He's having a phone conversation. If I need to, I can come and see him. I said, do you want to see me? Well, I don't ask you unless you want to. It's very, very different. And when you phone, let's say to get an appointment, or you phone, call the shul. What do you get? Messages. Here, oh, that's mine. Speak to that. Send me a note. Send me a.
It's almost impossible to talk to a real person.
okay. And you feel that's the same way because it's a general trend that it applies to Jewish tradition as well.
Well, sure. Jewish tradition, I can't speak for the very Orthodox community. They're not that familiar with. But even when you listen to Marshall, he talks about his community where he lives. Where I live, there's no Orthodox. It's different. But when they're trying, let's say if you talk to kids in school, in high school, and college, very different. And the pandemic has pushed all that.
Okay, I think the pandemic has impacted obviously on religious faith communities as much as anyone else. And the consensus from those who are joining us also seems to be the written word. I believe it's about 70% because if it is written, it is taken more religiously, or the written word more or less spoken. So I would tend to agree that certainly with trends in communication, it's a lot easier to text than to speak with someone directly and have a direct dynamic of in-person engagement. I think we certainly have lost our skill to a certain extent in that area. When I work with some of my bar mitzvah students, so we talk about what their duty is in terms of their responsibilities with regards to the text of the Torah. So when they sometimes that wonderful bar mitzvah we had 2 weeks ago, she would always when she practiced, she would look up at the end and say the last few words, reciting it as opposed to looking at the written word. And I told her, you can't do that. Our tradition has both an oral and a written element, but you have to abide by those. You can't decide when you want to do that. You have to be reading from the script, from the written word. It's called Kriyah B'Torah, reading of the Torah. It's not recitation of the Torah. And when I visited a mosque a few years ago, they brought forth young kids who were learning the Quran, and they recite it. They don't have a text. They learn, those who take the course intensely, they learn to recite it by heart. They don't read the text. And of course, the text and the written word in Islam is very important, but they learn to recite it. When they're doing it religiously and ritually, they don't read. They recite it by heart. And that's their studies are based on that. Of course, you have to read it to learn it, but the goal is to be able to recite it by memory. That's not our tradition with the Torah, with the exception of the vowels and the trop, because those are not in a written form when you read those from the Torah. Those are an oral tradition that were only put into a written form about 1300 years ago, so people wouldn't forget it. But when you do it ritually, you don't have that written element. So it's fascinating, just this one element of Jewish tradition, when you read from the Torah and chant, there is both the written responsibility of looking at the words as they were written 2,000, 2,500 years ago, but maintaining the oral tradition of vowels and punctuation, which are not ritually in any written form. You have to memorize those. So it's a fascinating combination. Why do I bring this up? Because often we don't think about how we balance speech and written word. We're aware of it to an extent, but we don't often pay enough attention to it. And I came across a beautiful explanation in this week's Parashah from Rabbi Jan Urbach, who I'm not sure if she still is, but she was the director of something called the Block Volker Center for Spiritual Arts at JTS. And she wrote something a number of years ago about this Parsha called Words Fail Me. And I want to share some of that with you because it connects to something we discussed, I think, at our last class or from the drasha a couple of weeks ago that I gave, where we talked about communication between Jacob and his sons, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, intergenerational, interfamily, interspousal communication. And I think the point was that we found that communication was a real challenge for the matriarchs and the patriarchs in the Genesis narrative. We often find that they were unable or unwilling to convey what they thought with a spoken word. They may have done things, but they didn't often talk about what they were doing and explain to their spouses, to their children, to their parents, what or why they were doing things. And we read more than once that, for example, with Jacob, when his eldest son sleeps with his concubine, whatever that gesture meant, well, if there was rebellion, what does it say about Jacob? Va'aviv, it says nothing. It says nothing. There's no response whatsoever. Jacob doesn't say a thing to reprimand or respond. And when Jacob becomes aware of the antagonism between Joseph and his brothers, what does it say? Initially, it says, Va'aviv shamar et hadavar. And Jacob kept it to himself. Didn't say anything, didn't respond, didn't speak, didn't use the power of speech to try to deal with the situation and mitigate any future conflict. And we read about with Joseph and his brothers as well. What does it say? It says right at the beginning, Velo yachlu dabro l'shalom. They were unable to say anything kind to him, anything peaceful to their brother. And we followed that process where by the end of the Genesis narrative in Parashat Vayechi, it says, and they were able to speak with their brother. And Joseph said words to console his brothers. So finally, at some point in their relationship, impacted by jealousy and other emotional influences, they're unable to speak. They're just simply unable to speak to themselves in an appropriate and effective manner. And I bring that up because in this week's Parsha, according to Rabbi Jan Urbach, speech is a very important element of how God attempts to communicate with Moses, how Moses attempts and is challenged by the ability to communicate because of his speech impediment, as we understand, and how that spoken word is affected by slavery and oppression, beginning with a verse, if you want to turn to it, or you can just take my word for it, in something we read this morning. Speech, of course, implies what? When somebody speaks, what are we hoping for? What do we assume is going to take place?
Information.
So what does communication mean? If somebody's speaking or someone's listening,
Was
simply listening.
listening.
You can
Yeah.
speak all you want, but a soliloquy, a monologue without any attentive audience is not worth a whole lot. So one of the verses we read this morning, if you're on the Eitz Chaim, page 353, if you're in any other Chumash, chapter 6, verse 9 of the book of Exodus, Vaydeber Moshe Cain el bnei Israel, velo sham'u el Moshe mikotze ruach u'me'avodah kasha. But when Moses told this, what God had said to him and promised to him right before, to the Israelites, they would not listen to Moses. Interestingly, it says in the Hebrew, velo sham'u el Moshe, and they did not listen. Here it says they would not listen in the English. That's already an interpretation and a commentary on the Hebrew. The Hebrew literally means they did not listen. I'm going to come back to that phrase in a minute. The Eitz Chaim has interpreted that or made a comment saying they would not listen. That's not the Hebrew. Their spirits crushed by cruel bondage. Okay, so I'm just going to read something from Jan Urbach just to get us into a bit of a frame of mind of what her message is. Words fail me. The common idiom, so casually tossed off in a moment of surprise, expresses a deep truth. Words do indeed fail us, sometimes to tragic effect. That is why the Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, understands our exile in Egypt as the exile of speech, a failure of words. In this reading, the breakdown of speech is both cause and effect of our enslavement, while healing and redeeming speech, finding our voice, is both the process and hallmark of redemption. So she's saying that when we talk about exile and being oppressed in any way, one of the things that is impacted most significantly is speech. If you think about it, think about any situation where people are oppressed, whether it's slaves, whether it's a gender issue. When people are oppressed in any relationship, they often lose the ability, the willingness, the empowerment to express themselves and speak in the way we would like speech to be to any effect. And when you think of, even if we go back to slavery, if you talk about slavery, Black slavery in the United States, for example, we often talk about the slaves didn't have the opportunity because of education and oppression in order to express themselves in the written word. They didn't have an opportunity to speak on their behalfs. Their speech was oppressed as much as their physical situation. We often talk about what does arise out of that. Not so much speech, but song. There's a lot of music that arises out of that experience in Black slavery. And I'm generalizing and simplifying, of course, but this is something that they talk about. There isn't the ability to effectively use speech to express themselves. Often they don't have the education. They don't have the opportunity. You speak up and you're punished for that. So the effects of oppression, whether on a family basis, a relationship basis, or a national basis, is something that oppresses speech and the opportunity to express oneself in an effective, honest, and open way, according to Jan Urbach. Bela.
And that would be that in some ways we're taught also not to use speech, that in some situations it's best not to speak. So when you walk into like a Shiva house or whatever, you don't necessarily, or it used to be that you were told, don't speak and wait to be spoken to, or sometimes it's best not to respond. So in this respect, you know, emotionally, when you're saying about people not responding or that they were upset, is also that emotional things that you use to act as a barrier and it prevents the other person from continuing. So you know, it's just a different layer of, it's another form of communication, but it's non-communication.
Right. So speech is, we're not saying speech is necessary. I don't think that's, she's not saying speech is necessary in every situation, but sometimes we limit our ability to speak. And more often, at least in these situations, our ability is limited by others to speak and to offer what we would like to say. But you're right, we choose sometimes, but if you think about it, choosing not to use speech because of circumstances is still a limitation on our ability to feel comfortable about using speech. I certainly differentiate between being comfortable about using speech or awkward, as opposed to not being allowed to speak completely. That's there's a difference, perhaps quantitatively and qualitatively, but still you're limiting your speech because of circumstances. You don't feel comfortable, you don't feel it appropriate to say what you might like to say because you're afraid it's going to be awkward or inappropriate and undesired. Absolutely, absolutely. Barb.
Only a couple of generations ago, where the adage was children should be seen and not heard. And I think that it compounded itself to a lot of us having been affected by that and moving on where you really aren't comfortable speaking because you never were supposed to speak.
Okay.
Grow up, if you look at little kids, as they're going to school and start nursery or they go some. Don't speak, don't speak. That's what we're taught. As babies, almost. Or as next to babies. Wait for your turn.
So I think, but I think today, COVID notwithstanding, I think there's a much greater openness and sensitivity to encourage education and expression than it was in our time when we grew up. Definitely a generational issue. And I don't think Rabbi Urbach's article would have resonated the same way 25 years ago. Today, we're much more aware of the need to allow, encourage people to speak, especially when there are things that need to be dealt with and when healing needs to occur. We think about the silencing of Indigenous issues for generations, and only now, only in the last 10 years and more, and much more so in the last few years, has the Indigenous community felt empowered and safe and secure in bringing up all the issues that should have been dealt with or should not have happened in the first place from generations ago. So I think there's a much greater willingness, despite trends of not being willing to engage in interpersonal communication. There's a much greater awareness of the need to encourage and allow. I think that word in itself is problematic. Who are we to allow or disallow speech? I think to encourage, acknowledge, and recognize everyone's right and need to speak freely in the appropriate circumstances.
But
Rosie.
even those.
Michael, we can't hear what the people in the shul are saying. At least I can't.
Allowing speech for them to express their feelings and thoughts.
So I just want to take a look at a couple of verses here that speak about some of the challenges with speech in our Parashah. So if you go to chapter 5, verse 8, on page 339 in the Eitz Chaim.
339.
If I have the right verse here, just a second.
Was that verse 5, chapter 5, Michael?
I'm sorry, verse 2. My apologies, but page 338, verse 2. So when Moses comes to Pharaoh and with Aaron, it says, "Vayomer Paro, mi Adonai asher eshma b'kolo l'sharachat Yisrael." Who is the Lord that I should heed him? And again, heed, lishmoa can also be used to heed, to abide by what somebody's telling you. But the literal, who am I that I should even listen to your God? Why should I bother listening? And why does it say this? Because the Zohar takes the word paro and breaks it into two pieces, two parts. Peh, ra'ah, mouth and evil. So as opposed to the words that are offered to encourage, to help people heal, Pharaoh represented, in contrast here, the exact opposite of that. Speech can be used for good purposes, but we all know through Lashon Hara, speech can be used for evil purposes. And so Pharaoh, of course, he would say, according to the Zohar interpretation, of course he would say, who am I to listen to God? The things you're trying to say go against what I'm saying. He would not call what he's saying evil, but that's the essence of it. Everything he utters is of an evil nature. Throw the firstborn male children into the river, kill them, enslave these people, take away the straw so to make their lives even more oppressive and more difficult. Everything Pharaoh says in the Zohar's interpretation is of an evil nature, as opposed to Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue, as we often refer to Hebrew in general, but in a more general way, in a less specific translation, Lashon HaKodesh, words that are spoken for holy purposes, as opposed to words that are spoken for evil purposes. Lashon Hara, Lashon HaKodesh. And so when we look at a number of other places, let's take a look at another verse. We mentioned before this idea that the children of Israel did not hear, Velo Shamu, that's the verse we were looking at before, chapter 6, verse 9. Velo Shamu mikotz haruach ume'avodah kasha. So there are different meanings to that. I would always prefer to translate something literally and then explore what other possible meanings. The Eitz Chaim kind of jumps the gun a little bit, or steals the thunder of interpretation. So literally it means they did not hear what Moses was telling them. Now, why would they not have heard in this Parsha? If you remember from the end of the last Parsha, what happens in Shmot? Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and ask him, please let the people out. And then what does Pharaoh said? No, what does he explain? He says, they're asking, and you're asking, they become lazy. Obviously, their life is too easy and they think they get it. So I'll show them, you think you got something to complain about now, I'm going to take away the straw, let them find the straw themselves. If they have too much time on their hands, and this is crucial, they obviously have too much time on their hands to waste asking for things that are not going to be coming. So let them spend all their time invested in the tasks at hand, not just making the bricks, but looking for the straw. So not only they will not have time to think and speak what they might want to, they're not going to have time to sleep or eat properly because of all this additional work. And so that connects beautifully with the verse we read before. Why did they not hear Moshe? Because me'avodah kasha u'mikotze ruach. Kotze ruach means shortness of spirit or breath. I'll come back to that in a second. And avodah kasha, because of hard labor. Think about it. How often do you have time to communicate with members of your family in the past or in the present when you're overwhelmed with professional or other activities? When are you able to find the time to speak with them, not just in a curt, practical way, but to speak words of healing, Lashon HaKodesh, words of holiness that help heal and deal with real situations, to be attentive, because we talked about before, in order to have somebody speak, you have to have somebody willing to listen. So even if they were conversing with you and saying things, did you have time to listen? No, because your mind is on 50 other things that you need to get done before you go to sleep that night. So if you don't have time, then you can't have meaningful, significant communication, either speaking or listening. And when it talks about the multiple meanings of that word, they did not hear Moses, this is what she writes. Velo, they did not, could mean did not, a simple failure. They did not hear, they didn't hear him. Or would not, a willful failure. They would not hear him. And velo shamu might mean that they actually did not hear Moses speaking, that they heard him speaking but did not listen to what he had to say because of the reasons we talked before, that they heard Moses' words but did not understand or take in their meaning. They listened, but they couldn't understand because, again, there are different levels to attentiveness. You can hear something without really hearing anything. You hear the sound, but you don't really hear the words. Or you can hear it, but you're not listening to it. Or you're listening, but you haven't got the ability because of the fact that you're oppressed and rushed to really try to understand their meaning, or that they understand but did not heed because their experience before was not a positive one. He'd promised them, I'm going to take you out of Egypt. And then what happens? Their life gets worse. So you hear what he's saying, you heard what he said the last time. You don't want to heed what they're saying because it only worked out very poorly for us the previous time. Why would I want to subject myself to the chance of my circumstances getting even worse than the horrible reality that they are currently? So our circumstances impact very significantly on our ability, our willingness to listen, and that willingness and ability to share and energy to share meaningful words. Furthermore, she says, the word ruach, kotze ruach, I said, how do they translate it here? They say, let me just get the translation, see if it's literal. Their spirits are crushed. Okay, so they go with the interpretation of spirit. Some commentators translate ruach as breath and the failure to hear as a physiological response. Rashi, for example, comments that one who is under stress is short of wind and breath and is unable to breathe deeply. So because of that, you can't speak if you're having trouble breathing. You can't, you can, I'm sure you can remember times when you were out of breath after whatever circumstances, and you can't speak. You physically can't, physiologically can't speak. The Netziv, a 19th century commentator from Belarus, notes that the physical impact of stress, shallow breathing, limits our attention span. It becomes difficult to tolerate longer speech. Which demands both explanation and an extended period of focus and concentration. Alternatively, as we suggested before, ruach could mean not a physical, but an emotional, intellectual, or spiritual limitation. The Ramban, Nachmanides from Spain, translates kotze ruach as impatience of spirit, resulting from fear and avodah kasha, hard labor, as lack of time to hear and consider, resulting from the pressure of Pharaoh's demands. Here's another interesting final commentary by the Or HaChaim, a commentator from Morocco. Perhaps because they had not yet been given the Torah, they were unable to hear, and this is called kotze ruach, because the Torah expands a person's consciousness. So here, as Rabbi Orbach explains, the study of Torah, both its content and in its methodology, its use of words, is seen as offering training in how to hear and understand more deeply, more expansively, more generously, and more hopefully. So this idea of Torah as a tool, guide, and instruction of how to hear, to listen, and how to speak, and I would add through the generous narratives, how not to speak improperly or how not to hear, because we often learn as much by the inappropriate or ineffective behavior of characters in the Torah as we do from the good and role modeling behavior of them. I'll read one last thing from her. She says, taken together, we see some striking and disturbing parallels to our own culture. Stress, overwork, impatience, narrow self-concern, and lack of intellectual and emotional discipline often prevent us from listening deeply, from taking the time to hear and attend to the voices that elevate and offer genuinely constructive paths forward. So this idea that we're not always willing to make the effort for all sorts of reasons, circumstances in the Torah, Kotzer Ruach, Avodah Kasha, and you can easily equate those with things that we experience today on a daily basis. It may not be physical slavery, it may not be shortness of physiological breath, but certainly we experience circumstances on a regular basis where we feel that same oppression of our emotional and our physiological welfare. And there's no question, in addition to what Rabbi Urbach says, that impacts on our ability to listen, to be attentive, and to respond with the appropriate and effective words. Lashon HaKodesh, holy healing language, in the words of Rabbi Urbach, is a demanding and courageous act. Words do indeed fail, and speech is always in danger of going into exile. But as the Torah teaches, redemption begins with listening. Because what's the first thing we read in Parashat Shmot after the fact that a new Pharaoh arose that didn't know Joseph, etc.? Vayishma Elohim et nakatan. God heard their cries out for help. So if there's somebody to hear, if there's some entity that is there available for hearing, and they acknowledge our pain and suffering, there's more chance that we'll feel free and empowered and safe to express our concerns and our need for help. And if that takes place, that mutuality of healing can also take place between those who can offer the healing and those who need the healing under those circumstances. So there's a lot more that we could explore here, but
Try to teach communication skills and relationship skills. It's a very important piece of it.
We don't hear.
I never realized it's coming to here.
it can come from the Torah if we're willing to look for that interpretation.
It came from the Torah. No, we just-
Yeah.
Now it's coming out.
Well, that's why taking the teaching of people who come from very different disciplines. I mean, we talked Rabbi Jan Auerbach. I happen to remember her from Toronto. She's the Center for Spiritual Arts. So somebody who comes from a different discipline, whether from psychology, from sociology, those perspectives can certainly give us a broader and more expansive understanding of what the Torah may have in mind. I think the Torah in general is something that we need in order to study Torah properly. We have to be in circumstances where we're attentive. You can't study Torah, as they say, al-katzeh leg, at the tip of the fork, when you have a moment. I'm not saying that's not worth it, but in order to study Torah properly, you can't be suffering from kotzer ruach or avodah kasha. You can't feel oppressed by time. You can't feel that you're short of breath and short of patience, because then you don't allow yourself to be sufficiently attentive and open to what the Torah may be trying to say.
present is really quite interesting, and it's looking at it from a psychological point of view, and a very important method of communication. Using all of what is said, spirituality, readiness, airedness, openness, all of those things. I would never look at it this way. I mean, kind of like that.
Right, right. And that's why we need to always look for a variety of interpretations. That's what the Torah is about. It's not only reading it literally, as you may read that one sentence, v'lo shamu. They didn't listen. Why didn't they listen? What prevented them from listening? And so I think part of the message is not just to understand this, but what brings about the inability of people to listen or to express themselves, their circumstances. And so our lesson from this is as much to make sure that we, when we have the power to do so, change people's circumstances for the better, so they're allowed, they have the ability to both listen and to express themselves. It's not just to look at it psychologically, but as a sociological responsibility, as a community responsibility we have to make sure that everybody has that opportunity and feels empowered to be able to use their innate skills and abilities in listening and expression.
Good question. So at the beginning, you asked about Yiddish, about a percentage we would put on Yiddish language and culture.
Or not Yiddish, but Jewish tradition, Jewish, not in the sense of language, but Jewish tradition in general, and perhaps specifically our texts.
Oh, because I was thinking about the Yiddish language.
Okay.
So I'm saying, that's what my question is, why would you ask about the Hebrew? But I guess with my interpretation, when you asked that question, I was thinking the Yiddish language.
So that's a great example of the beginning of communication and understanding. So the fact that there was something that was miscommunicated, misunderstood, and it's a mutual thing. It's never one side. I was very clear, Rosalie, you just didn't understand what I had to say. No, that's not the case. So no.
Once in a lifetime.
On the contrary, so obviously we weren't yet in a situation where we were sufficiently attentive and sufficiently clear in expression to make sure that we're on the same wavelength. Well, sometimes when we say Jewish, they're Jewish, we often use Yiddish, Jewish for Yiddish.
For me,
Someone must make a comment.
Yeah, I will.
for me, it would have been oral in Yiddish.
You say a word.
Because I can understand Yiddish more than I can read the
Right.
Yiddish. But had you said Hebrew, I think I would have said the opposite.
Okay,
Interesting.
so great. So experience impacts very significantly an education on our ability in whatever. So I did promise the virtual joiners to have an opportunity to speak. So Brenda, go ahead. Hopefully people can hear.
So I'm going to throw a whole different perspective into this lack of communication, and I'm going to use the word fear. And it starts with last week's Parashah, where a new Pharaoh came and he didn't know Joseph. He didn't know his name. And I was reading something interesting, and I think the reason why he didn't know his name is because Joseph had an Egyptian name. And he wasn't known in Egypt by Joseph, but by whatever his Egyptian name was. So there was already a fear that all of a sudden I've got these throngs of strangers and I don't know what to do with them. So what am I going to do with them? I'm going to make their life miserable. Along comes Moses, and he didn't have the support of anybody. He didn't have any leaders. He didn't have the support of Pharaoh, and certainly not of the Egyptian people. He was an outsider. And I think the fear, the only support he had was his own brother Aaron, and even Aaron needed to be convinced. So when Moses got up to speak in front of Pharaoh, Pharaoh laughed at him. He says, "Who are you? And what gives you the authority to tell me there's some God that I don't know telling me what I should be doing?" So I think that's a different way to look at it.
Yeah, no, certainly. Thank you, Brenda. All right, well, it's been a pleasure as always studying with all of you.